given the likelihood that we will, by the midsummer, put COVID in the rear mirror, given a very competitive dollar. To take a potentially booming economy and to put on top of it $1.9 trillion of stimulus is to take real chances of a kind that I don't believe we need to take. The historically remembered LBJ guns and butter collision involved excesses on the order of 1 to 2% of GDP. We don't know enough about the Phillips curve. We don't have enough experience to make confident forecasts. But when we are speaking of fiscal actions of this potential magnitude on top of an economy that quite likely would be booming with no further fiscal stimulus, we are, I believe, taking imprudent risks. The prospect has been held out that the Fed can manage any problems that arise. That is not my reading of the historical experience. My reading of the historical experience is that almost every time the inflation has accelerated and the Fed has felt it necessary to step in to prevent inflation from accelerating, the result has been that the economy has gone into recession. The Fed has had essentially no success in engineering soft landings. Every time unemployment has risen by 0.5%, it has risen by 2%. And so the risks are very substantial of collision. Those risks might be worth running if that was necessary in order to provide relief, but it isn't. They might be worth running if this was all that was at stake. But, and this brings me to my final point, the centerpiece of the president's campaign, rightly, was a program of building back better through large-scale public investment in preventing climate change, in infrastructure, in education, in the caring economy. And what's contemplated is trillions of dollars of further investment on top of a situation that is potentially problematic in terms of its aggregate demand impact. What should happen instead? There's nothing wrong with a $1.9 trillion target or even a larger target. But the emphasis should be on public investment and building back better, preparing us to protect the climate, preparing us to compete with China, preparing us to be a more just society. As many economists have advocated, there's an important role for triggers. I could be wrong. It could turn out that COVID is much longer lasting than now looks likely. We've seen that Congress can be dysfunctional. Triggers that would increase unemployment insurance, if that were to happen, or in extremis would provide benefits to households, would be appropriate.
So
but a much better program, I'm just stopping, a much better program would be a program that was focused on meeting necessary relief needs in a targeted and efficient way, focused on public investment with contingency triggers if the economy were to turn down. That would be a better basis for durable prosperity.
Thanks a lot, Larry. You made a very strong point that the size, essentially, if it was spread over the years and it were more investment focused, I guess it would be different in terms of inflation expectations. Paul had recently revived his blog and had a very nice first entry in his new blog. And so we're very glad to have him back in the blogosphere. And I'm sure that Paul has his own perspective, and I'm curious to find out, we all are curious to find out what his perspective is on this Biden stimulus.
Okay. I found myself remembering some physics history as getting ready for this discussion. A very young Wolfgang Pauli, after hearing a presentation by Albert Einstein, said, what Professor Einstein has to say is not entirely stupid. So what Larry had to say is not entirely, no, I mean, I think there's a very serious point, which is that we should indeed be thinking about the macroeconomics of this big program. But I have a quite different take, and I think it is not to say that Larry's concerns are entirely off base, but I think that they're exaggerated, and you do need to think about what are the actual alternatives here. So I think the first thing to say, which I've been trying to say since the very early stages, but just doesn't seem to get through, is that this is not about stimulus. We are not in a conventional recession. It is something, it's a combination supply and demand shock, but I don't think it really helps. We're still essentially in a partial lockdown, which is in part the result of government policies, bans on full-scale indoor dining and so on, but largely also just voluntary. Who's going to be dumb enough to, some people will, but you shouldn't, even if it's allowed, you shouldn't be going to full indoor restaurants. And this means that we have a situation of suppressed output, which is not well described by the concept of an output gap. It is not the case that if we had sufficient aggregate demand, we would be back up to some estimate of potential output. We are rightly not doing a lot of stuff we would normally be doing. Which means that the whole framework of stimulus to fill an output gap is not the right way to think about where we are. I've suggested that we think about it as disaster relief, or in some ways it's like fighting a war. And when Pearl Harbor gets attacked, you don't say how big is the output gap. Let's size the defense budget based on plausible multipliers to fill that output gap. That's not what you do. You just spend enough to actually win the struggle that you're in, which doesn't mean, although it's not stimulus, it can nonetheless be stimulative. So there is you do want to think about the macroeconomics of it, but you do want to do that with the understanding that that's not the purpose of what you're doing. And for what it's worth, if you think of this as being a temporary emergency that requires a bunch of spending, which I think we all do, question, how should that spending be paid for? Well, this is pure standard public finance theory, which says that if you have a temporary need for a bunch of spending, you don't want to raise taxes to fully pay for it. You want to spread it out over time. So a largely deficit financed response is appropriate. Before I get into the size issue, I think it's helpful to think about where does this come from? How does the spending get to be so big relative to the output shortfall? And I don't think I don't think output gap is an appropriate framework in any case. And the size of the output shortfall relative to what you might have expected is very contingent upon what you, where you thought we were in 2019. And I'm not of the view that we were actually above potential output then. So there are some issues there, but it's clearly, by any reasonable calculation, we're talking about a spending package that is at least twice and probably more than that the size of the shortfall in nominal GDP that relative to what we should have expected. So what's in there? Three components. I'd say conceptually, you want to think about three components. First, there's public goods spending related to the pandemic. Shots in arms, making schools safe to reopen. Quite several $100 billion of stuff that is really quite clearly directly related to the public health emergency. It's not most of the package, but it's a significant part of it. Second, there's income support. The unemployment insurance being the most important part of that, and the income support is it's a big deal. And to some extent, you want to think of aid to state and local governments as being a kind of income support. That because of our fiscal federalism and balanced budget requirements, lower levels of government are in some ways in the same position as liquidity constrained unemployed workers. They need aid to tide them over. And then the third part, there's a bunch of stuff that is